Penguin Random House Audio presents The Knockoff by Lucy Sykes and Joe Piazza. Read for you by Katherine Kellgren. For the boys, Ewan, Heathcliff and Titus. For John and Tracy. For all the Imogen Tates. Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. Oscar Wilde. In order to be irreplaceable, one must always be different. Coco Chanel. Prologue. September 5th, 1999. The pretty young associate editor crossed her bare legs nervously, allowing her right foot to bounce up and down. She worried her black boucle pencil skirt might be a touch too short for sitting in the front row. By most measures, she was perfectly ordinary in this crowd of black-clad men and women in fine Italian fabrics cut in French lines made with an American sensibility. She looked the part. Still, she couldn't believe she was actually there. Never in a million years could she have imagined she would be sitting in the front row of a New York City fashion show during Fashion Week. She flipped the heavy vellum invitation over one more time to read the embossed gold writing. There was no mistake. Her seat was 11A. She was in the right place at the right time. At 26, Imogen Tate had already been poring over the photographs from these fashion shows with her bosses at Moda magazine for 5 years, but she had never seen one in the flesh. This plum assignment for the Oscar de la Renta show only came her way because the senior editors were overscheduled. Bridget Hart, a striking black model and one of Imogen's 3 roommates, was walking in this show. Imogen glanced at her watch. 5:30. It was scheduled to start at 5, but the seats weren't even close to being filled. Despite Bridget promising her that nothing ever began on time during Fashion Week, Imogen arrived promptly at 4:45. Best to be early. She considered getting up to say hello to her friend Audrey, a publicist for Bergdorf Goodman, who was chatting with a reporter from the Trib about 10 seats away, but Imogen worried someone would steal her assigned seat. She'd been warned about one particularly vigilant new money socialite who could never secure front row and would hover along the periphery waiting for her chance to pounce if someone didn't show up. A piece of hair fell into Imogen's face, and she quickly tucked it back behind her ear. Only last week she had let her new colorist persuade her to return to her natural blonde after a series of more dramatic, darker shades. It was understated. Chic was the right word to describe her new life in America. Ouch! Imogen lifted her foot and scowled at the paparazzo who had trampled on her exposed little toe in the very best and only strappy snakeskin sandals that she owned. "You're in the way," he sneered. "I'm in my seat," Imogen countered in her most distinguished British accent. She added an emphasis on my. It was indeed her seat and her name on the invitation. That meant something. The fashion industry was an insular community of designers, editors, retail buyers, and select heiresses. Access to these kinds of events was allotted stingily and could easily be taken away. "Well, your seat is in my way," the ornery photographer said before darting across the plastic-covered runway to take a picture of Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of Vogue, as she gracefully took her own place across the runway from Imogen. With Anna seated, the show could finally begin. Security men in bulky black turtlenecks carrying large walkie-talkies ushered the photographers into a holding pen at the end of the runway. All photos from the show were under strict embargo, pending approval from the designer. Imogen had a little point-and-shoot camera in her bag, but she didn't dare take it out. She had taken plenty of pictures outside the tents in Bryant Park and planned to drop the film at one of those one-hour developing places on her way back to work. From inside her purse, she removed a small black notebook. Assistants in head-to-toe black stripped the industrial plastic from the runway, revealing a pristine white surface. The lights dimmed, and the house grew silent. The crowd respectfully slipped their purses and briefcases under their chairs. So attentive was the audience of what was happening on the runway that they even refrained from whispering to one another or shuffling papers on their laps once the lights went down. Out of the silence, a dance beat boomed Livin' La Vida Loca by Ricky Martin as white light bathed the room. Models, never breaking their gaze, strode down the catwalk one after the other. Imogen hardly had time to take notes on each of the looks. This really would be an excellent time to use that camera, but she didn't dare. Across from her, Imogen noticed Jacques Santos. Dressed in his signature white jeans, the photographer-turned-creative director for one of the big magazines whipped out his Nikon and furiously began shooting the models as they walked past him. Out of the corner of her eye, Imogen could see security begin to twitch from their posts at the end of the runway. It wasn't until Jacques actually stood and hoisted the camera over his head to take an aerial shot that they made their move. Perfectly timed between models, one guard approached Jacques from either side, and before the Frenchman knew what was happening, they tackled him and confiscated his camera. He lay stunned on the runway. Bridget, Imogen's statuesque friend, didn't even blink as she calmly stepped over the man in her thigh-high leather boots and continued her journey down the runway with the elegance of a panther, her right toe slightly pointed as it rose off the ground. The camera in one hand, the security guard pulled Jacques to his feet, dusted him off, and gestured for him to sit back down. He removed the film from the Nikon and handed the camera back before returning to his post at the end of the aisle. The show went on. Chapter 1. August 2015. At first, Imogen didn't recognize the girl twirling around in her chair, taking a picture of her own magenta Tory birch flats and matching fingernails. One hand clutched her white and gold iPhone, while the other extended toward her shoes, manicured fingers splayed in front of the screen. Imogen smoothed her fine blonde hair behind her ears and gave a confident click with her right heel, so the girl, now pouting into the phone's camera to take a selfie, would know she wasn't alone in the corner office. Oh! Eve Morton, Imogen's former assistant, snapped to attention, startled. The phone clattered to the floor. A note of surprise rose in Eve's husky voice as she glanced over Imogen's shoulder to see if anyone else was behind her. "You're back?" The girl's coltish legs covered the space between them in a few seconds before she wrapped Imogen in a hug that felt too familiar. Eve looked different now. Her auburn curls were blown out, some sort of keratin treatment, most likely. The shiny, pin-straight hair framed a flawlessly made-up face, with a slightly newer, cuter nose than Imogen remembered. Why was Eve sitting at the desk of the editor-in-chief? Imogen's desk? Imogen racked her brain to find any reason Eve would be in this building at all so early in the morning. She no longer worked here. She had been Imogen's assistant 2 years ago and hadn't been back since. Eve had been an extraordinarily competent assistant and, for all intents and purposes, a friend. But this was an irritating distraction on her first day back at work. All Imogen wanted was to get settled before the rest of the staff arrived, call down for a cappuccino, and have someone help her wade through the inevitable swamp of her email. "Eve? Darling, why are you here? I thought you were off at Harvard Business School." Imogen sidestepped her to settle into her chair. Sinking into the leather seat after so much time away felt good. The girl folded her long legs beneath her instead of crossing them when she sat facing Imogen. "I finished in January, actually. I went to a startup incubator in Palo Alto for a few months. Then I came back here in July." What was a startup incubator? Imogen wondered. She imagined it had something to do with chickens, but didn't have the inclination or the interest to ask. "Back to New York? That's lovely. I'm sure some monstrous investment bank has snatched you up now that you have an MBA. Imogen replied evenly, pressing the power button on her computer.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?